All right. Thank you so much for joining us today for From the Field, Farm Chat with Idaho Wheat. Today we are talking to Kat Salois and Richard Fillmore from the McGregor Company. And I will go ahead and let them introduce themselves in just a second. I am Brittany. I'm the Executive Director of the Idaho Wheat Commission. And I want to make sure everyone who's on today knows that you are welcome to ask any questions. You can do that one of a few ways. So you can unmute your microphone. I will see that and kind of give you a shout out. You can use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen to raise your hand, or you can type your question into the chat box at the bottom of the screen and we'll make sure it gets asked. So, and you can send that either to the whole group or just to me individually, whichever you are more comfortable with. So thank you very much for taking the time out of your schedules, Kat and Richard. Kat, I'll just start with you. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, give us your background, a little bit of what you do at the McGregor Company.
Sure. So I'm the director of research for the McGregor Company, which means that the company does have its own research program. I'm one of 4 people that is dedicated to nothing but that. I've been with the company. This is going on my 9th year. Some of the other caps that I wear as other duties as described, I also run the company's marketing team and marketing department. They report through me. And do quite a bit of the company's product development. So our research program does evaluate new product concepts and pushes those into field-ready concepts, along with discovering or really investigating any agronomic problem that our account managers or customers sees as a limiting factor in their operations.
Okay, and Richard, what about you?
Yeah, so my job, I'm actually an account manager, so I'm the one that creates the problems for Kat. I also help with the research on our part of it, help Kat in deciding which treatments we want to see, and at least for our part of the world. But I work specifically and only in seed treatments, so seed care. We do everything from sweet corn to popcorn to beans, dry beans, garden beans, alfalfa. If it's grown in southern Idaho, we pretty much have we touch it. I work out of Twin Falls. That's where my office is currently. I've been with the company for approximately 15 years now, and doing seed care for about 12 of those years. So. And excited to be here. So thank you, Brittany, for inviting us.
Yes,
We're happy to have you. All right. Well, I guess one of the first questions for you, Kat, is what trends have you seen in the soils and production in the Pacific Northwest?
Well, I suppose that's I guess a broad topic, and it is worth noting that although Richard is in southern Idaho, I focus primarily, I do support our seed care team, but it would be specifically around seed care topics. So this would really be the inland Northwest. A majority of our retail branches will reach from, let's say, Grangeville to Ellensburg, Oregon, so the northern parts of Oregon, into the northern panhandle of Idaho. So not necessarily southern Idaho at all, if that makes sense.
That does make sense.
Okay, so you said soil trends throughout our region?
Yeah.
We tend to have our region, and I'll say dryland, because I do think there is a relatively large distinction in between the dryland components and our irrigated components. McGregor Company touches about 75% of our business is considered dryland versus irrigated. As a general trend, I mean, there's a lot of talk around the acidifying nature of our soils. That trend, we can see that in our soil tests. So I have right at 10 years. So that would be reducing pH in that acidic range, not dramatically in 10 years, but those, you do have to look at overall trends. I mean, just speaking broadly, if you want to know like nutrient kind of trends, our soils tend to be high calcium soils, so considered calcareous. We tend to have very low phosphorus numbers in our soils. Potassium is one of the most widely variable nutrients that we have across our acre. When we're thinking about micronutrient trends, our soils tend to be very, as in excessive, borderline toxically high in iron and manganese. They tend to always be deficient in boron and zinc. Copper tends to be very regional in affiliation. But those are some general trends if we're talking about nutrient distributions and soil pH parameters.
So Kat, how does that affect what you are recommending today versus recommendations for crop nutrients, 15, 20 years ago? I mean, obviously you have different products available out there. You have soil pH problems to deal with. So your recommendations are continuing to evolve at some level or another.
Yes, we tend to focus a lot on nutrient use efficiency, so how we can drive more production for the amount of fertility that we are putting down. I noticed that there's quite a few breeders and genetic representation on the call, and I do think it is an interesting trend that as a general whole, what my research program has noticed is that wheat varieties across our region tend to have gotten more efficient with their nitrogen use, but actually less efficient on their phosphorus use. So we have focused a lot on phosphorus use efficiency. So phosphorus is a nutrient that is immobile in the soil. So we focus on how we can layer that nutrient throughout the profile instead of really concentrated in any one spot. So we focus on starter fertilizer bands. Wheat is highly reactive to phosphorus. It's a root encourager. There's been some great work in the last 10 years about how phosphorus bands tend to encourage deep vertical root development versus horizontal root development. So, I mean, when we're talking about the last 15 years, we as a company focus on driving nitrogen use efficiency, but also ways that we are feeding enough phosphorus into that system.
So a lot of that is starter fertilizers are seeing a big difference now in how those are impacting growth and development.
Yeah, so that would be a great trend of 10 years ago. They were, at least what I saw, is they were quite nitrogen and sulfur heavy. We've actually taken nearly all of the nitrogen and sulfur out of those bands and have replaced it with phosphorus, zinc, and root stimulators. So actually purposely trying to drive deep vertical root development, especially across our dryland region.
Right. So trying to help the breeders out and make their varieties more efficient.
Trying a little
Trying,
bit.
yeah, you
Yeah,
can
I
only
do
help
think
them so far.
I do think it is kind of fun to look at those efficiency differences where like nitrogen has obviously been a focus, but maybe some of the others hasn't.
Exactly. So I assume a lot of, I've always been impressed with the McGregor company, their commitment to R&D for many years now. I mean, your predecessor, Steve Reinertson, Bruce Palmer's many years of contributions also to your program there, and now you're there for 9 years. What are the kind of questions you're asking now that would be different than what Steve or Bruce would have been looking at 15, 20 years ago? I mean, what are you looking at now, or maybe some of the things that are actually the same that you're still looking at?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm chuckling slightly because like tale of two tapes, right?
Yeah.
I have, if you would have asked me, so I should have probably mentioned my schooling is all in plant genetics. I was a plant breeder for 10 years for DuPont Pioneer before getting the opportunity to move back home. I'm from Pullman, Washington, which, there's not a whole lot of soybean breeders in Pullman, Washington. So not a whole lot of opportunity to move back. So when I got the opportunity with McGregor Company, it was a great reason to come back home. If you would have asked me 15 years ago if I would be excited about nitrogen fertilization research in wheat, I would have rolled my eyes at you and said that sounds pretty foundational. So one of them is around placement of nitrogen and using nitrogen stabilizers. Well, Steve Reinertson, when he retired, actually threw down a 1980s compendium on my desk. Very first bit of research information in there was around InServe, which is a nitrogen stabilizer. So some things haven't changed, but how we use them have. Probably, I would say one of the bigger developments is my research program is turned into a lot of physiological traits in that plant, abiotic stress management. We look a lot at yield components and how we are affecting yield components. So specifically, if we use wheat as one of those examples, yield components being heads per acre, grains per head, and the weight of each one of those grains. Some of the work that, I mean, this is kind of stuff that makes sense when you say it out loud. When we plant in September and when we're in a cropping system where wheat is king, tillers rarely is our limiting factor. And this is something that when you really dive into recording and indexing yield components, head size and grain weight, well, head size more specifically, head size is nearly always our limiting factor, grain weight occasionally, but tillers not often. So tillers in, let's say, a late planted no-till system, something like that, yes. So, I mean, I'm broad sweeping, Rich, never works in agronomy, but for the most part, our region is not tiller limited. So that means if we're putting resources into creating more tillers, it often does a return an ROI on that farm. So that's been a pretty pivotal one for us, is by focusing on yield components as a limiting factor, it has pushed us to do more to maintain head size or pollen viability or things of that nature versus just focusing on front end loading all the components into our cropping system.
Good. I don't disagree with you at all. I think head fertility has been one of the key contributions to increasing yields over the last probably 15, 20 years. No
Right.
doubt.
Or you could, I mean, so a page out of my soybean book, right, is one of the biggest single factors I could select for in a high yielding soybean variety was length of flower, flowering duration. And I think we're seeing that play out in canola. Not necessarily timing of flowering, but flowering duration tends to be quite impactful. Staggering effects around pollination and wheat. If we can get that, fifth and sixth and seventh floret to pollinate, that's a big deal.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. So you guys do a lot of work on seed treatments, I know.
Yeah.
And what are you seeing in trends in seed treatments, or what's the are there new products that are exciting to you, or different uses, or the resistance issues you're dealing with on the seed treatment side?
Sure. This is where it's great to have Richard. I feel like probably some of the bigger trends is multiple modes of action in our fungicides. So most of the seed treatments will represent at least 4 different modes of action in that fungicide seed treatment package. The use rates of those fungicides are incredibly low. So the one that I keep the farm practical, kind of that hat comes on. Seed treatments will be the most cost-effective fungicide application you can make, just hands down. The use rate's incredibly small, and it's an excellent way to really protect that seed. So we have done quite a bit with multiple modes of action. So really safeguarding against a plethora of different diseases that could be prevalent, regardless of if you're planting early or late, get rain, you don't get rain. I mean, these are all contributors to dry land. From an insecticide standpoint, our company has done quite a bit with brofenilide or Taraxa. One of the biggest reasons, and I talked about this a lot at our grower meetings, is yes, I do support Richard from a seed treatment perspective, but our agronomists are involved with every decision on that farm. So if there's a herbicide complaint, that falls on my desk as well. One of the trends I've seen in our region is wireworms tend to be associated with resistant weeds. So the easiest way I have to scout for wireworms, which I've always laughed at, is, you can go out with these nylons and oatmeal balls and all kind of intensive screening methods, or you could grab a shovel and put boots on the ground and look for the weeds that you're having a hard time controlling. And I would 9 chances out of 10, you'll find wireworms there. So seeing these correlations of having to walk herbicide crop complaints and finding wireworms and knowing that we have an insecticide that can control them on seed, that's been a really big part of our seed treatment work. So brofenilide labeled in cereals, it isn't currently labeled in pulse crops. Something like Capture LFR is a product we could use in pulse crops by Fenthrin. It does have killing behavior on wireworm, but not labeled in cereals. So now we have tools that are different modes of action that we can use across an entire rotation that can actually control wireworm And the biggest reason I keep coaching our customers to control wireworm is to slow progression of resistant weeds. So it becomes a numbers game and a breeding factor. You know, the more of those weeds are exposed to the chemistry, faster those resistant weeds tend to pop up. So kind of a weird way to think about seed treatments from a weed resistance standpoint, but it is 100% a trend that we see.
No, and that makes sense a lot. You know, the herbicide resistance issues only continue to grow around the region as well. I mean, it's nice to see we have some new monies into some of the regional herbicide programs and that.
Yes.
But you do work on herbicides as well, I understand?
Yes, absolutely.
So where are you seeing the trends in herbicides, or where are your biggest fears or concerns over what we're losing right now as
Yeah.
time goes on?
Yeah, and now might proclamate just a little bit, but when the trend I saw is that when many of our basics started to merge and acquisitions were made, that tends to slow the innovation funnels down, right?
Yes.
So as those companies come together and consolidate, and they're, you know, ultimately there will be efficiencies in their R&D efforts. What we see short term, though, is usually a reduction in innovation that is coming out the backside. And I think we saw that. So there's been very few new modes of action enter the marketplace. I mean, since I've been back, quote unquote, for the last 9 years, Talonor, right? So you get, I mean, I can come up with very few options that in winter wheat that are brand new. So I hope that we see some innovation come up, but really when you start looking through the pipeline, very few of our suppliers are signaling that there's new modes of action that are projected to come to market in wheat in the next 10 years. So I don't even see it when I look behind the curtain a little bit.
So even just trying to maintain the effectiveness of those chemistries is the biggest challenge we have right now.
Correct.
And
So
obviously wheat's not the target for the big companies right now anyway. It's all we benefit if it happens working corn or soybeans.
correct, 100%. So I
Yeah.
feel like we've done a lot of what's old is new again. Our account managers are really taught to rotate modes of action. So, I mean, I could talk about whatever chemistry, but let's use coaxium as an example. I happen to work in a region where pulse rotations are really prevalent. So group 1 chemistries have been used for many years. Bruce Palmer, who you'd mentioned before, probably one of the most intelligent herbicide agronomists I've ever met, period. You know, when he was thinking about quinazoflop or aggressor, usually we'll get 3 or 4 uses of that chemistry before we are starting to see significant resistance. And I'm not saying that will always happen, but that's what history has shown. So we're thinking about ways that we can introduce multiple modes of action with aggressor. I mean, why do I think that pre-emergent chemistries, that it's not a nice to have, it's required. If you're farming, you need to be farming with pre-emergent chemistries. Aggressor or the coaxium system is an excellent example of that, that having another mode of action effective on your weed is necessary to maintain that tool, or history has shown what will happen. So we have tools to help maintain it, and we're actively coaching to get that tool to stay here as long as possible.
No, you're right. That is key. I mean, it's easy to misuse products and lose them, unfortunately. And so all of our growers need to be very conscious of how they're using chemicals and when they're using chemicals, and talk to the experts like yourself that know when to use and not to use. Those combinations are critical.
Yeah,
Well,
Bruce was
critical.
king of saying, if you liked your herbicide program this year, change it. Meaning, if it was effective, you have the opportunity to rotate that chemistry and try it again. Don't use it again in the exact same combination.
Right, right, absolutely. So you do a lot of variety testing as well. What are you seeing on the variety horizons? Is there things that are new or exciting that are? I mean, the coaxium system is one, obviously relatively new. We're kind of losing some of the Clearfield effectiveness, but there's still mainline varieties out there that are pretty productive and doing pretty well. What are you seeing on the horizon that's exciting?
Well, maybe it's a question for some other folks on the call as well. What I'm nervous about, and maybe not excited, but what I'm nervous about is When you look at what happened to breeding programs as they integrated something like Roundup Ready into soybeans, you lost productivity in your mainstream varieties, since usually that resource of the funnel is only so big. Are we going to see a lag in performance of varieties that don't have coaxium in them because programs had to split to incorporate that trait? I haven't seen it yet, but I mean, that leg is probably yet to come and yet to poke out the other side too.
That's kind of probably depend a bit on the breeding philosophy within each program as well, as to whether they're looking at that as a focus, or they're continuing the core of the base of the program from improvement and then bringing on traits alongside. But that's a little bit of a different issue. But there's such strong competition in varieties out there. What do you look for in a promising variety? I mean, you can only test so many, right?
Yeah. Yep.
They release another 100 every year. What do you do?
Yeah. So a lot of when I think about traits, I think about traits that bring resiliency into our farming system. So traits, and when I mean resiliency, things that will hopefully work in a drought year, in a heat year, in a stress year, that have some level of consistency. So you guys, breeders, often talk about maintaining performance over many locations, and part of that is that environmental component of that site year as well. Things that I think do contribute to that, I talked about vertical root development, so being able to mine more of that acre foot. I think that deep rooting structure, propensity to have that deep rooting structure, is access to our moisture. It's access to moisture deeper into the season. We can get nutrient availability deeper into the season. Usually that more prolific fibrous root system is ways that we can intercept non-mobile nutrients like zinc and phosphorus better as well. So vertical rooting systems, I think about things that create canopy cover as early as possible. So like in winter wheat varieties, I do go take notes on how fast we can get to canopy cover. I think it's important for, as we see environmental trends that will likely equal hotter and drier falls, that if we can just not touch that ground a little bit later, maybe that would be a benefit from the wheat scientist perspective. The quicker I can canopy that ground, the better weed control I have. Still, my #1 herbicide is good crop competition. So, kind of thinking about that entire agronomic package, and being able to maintain a cooler canopy. So others probably know this stat better than me. What is it, above 77 degrees or 78 degrees, wheat will actually go backwards in yield production. So if we can think of traits, and that canopy cover is one that can help cool the soil beneath it. So increased early season vigor, anything for less, so I would call the trait increased photosynthetic capability, especially under abiotic stresses. I think some of the work that WSU and Aaron Carter's program, specifically around abiotic stress response, I think that is just super intriguing. The reason I think that is intriguing is from a crop protection standpoint, I have many tools to help with diseases, seed treatments, fungicides, management practices, many tools. I don't have a lot of tools for drought resistance. So like that abiotic stress response is really interesting to me. And I think that's going to pay dividends in our region as years go.
Yes.
And I was thinking of extended grain fill, that right, in canola, that's a big factor. Our pulse crops, bigger factors. And I think that that's a bigger deal. If you can, that stay green trait that we talked about 25 years ago, now we have fertility programs that can actually keep up with that stay green concept.
No, I think you're right. The abiotic stress tolerance contribution to the breeders is just going to be increasingly important over time.
Yeah.
You also have a challenge of so many varieties, and you have public varieties, you have private varieties. Publics are starting to look more like private varieties. Are our growers getting too confused with too many offerings and too many varieties and too many choices?
I probably have a way more sarcastic response than most, because I'm coming from the corn and soybean world.
Okay.
Like, we haven't even sniffed. I mean, as a soybean breeder, my general life cycle plan was 3 years.
Yeah.
So I actually tend to err on the other side. Do our customers get confused? No, I really, they're quite savvy on variety selections. The other thing, I mean, for good or for great, really, many of the varieties that are coming into our, when's the last, I guess the question I'm trying to get to is, when's the last time we had a flop? Like just a variety that was 20% under test mean.
Oh, no, I wouldn't say flops necessarily, but there are a lot of releases that don't go anywhere, of course. I mean, there are probably 1 or 2 out of 10 that are actually successful in
Right.
choosing which of those are going, which you're going to, I guess, which horse you're going to ride is going to be more and more, or has been more and more challenging. From the days when you had, well, you could plant Stevens or you could plant Madsen, or you could plant
Yeah.
Stevens or you could plant Madsen. Okay, that's a little different these days now. And someone like you has to kind of lead that first charge of blowing away some of the chaff and trying to find the better materials to give your growers some good recommendations.
Yeah, and kind of the comment with the flop is the breeders and our variety testing programs that especially, I mean, in my region, WSU and OSU have excellent variety testing programs, and I think they do an excellent job of, there's just not that many failures. So then the risk becomes lower that, at worst, you're doing test average, right? So even, so I do think
that's a good way to put it. I think you're right. You're probably not going to lose, but you probably can gain by making some wise choices, huh?
Yeah, right. And I mean, even I guess I'm having a hard time really sifting through that because each company will tend to offer, let's call it 6 to 8 varieties. We have some placements based on diseases. That's typically what goes on. I tend to try to coach our customers. I'm a fan of understanding maturities. Because of our environmental conditions, that I think that tends to kind of quote unquote safeguard. That if you have only early maturities and we happen to get something like a really late season frost, those get hosed. If you have only late season maturity and we get some late season heat, those get hosed. So kind of diversifying that maturity spectrum a bit just to safeguard against environmental conditions.
Absolutely. And also, erring on earliness is always wise as well.
Well, kind of, until you get a frost that takes off 50% of that yield. Right. So I'm like, there's pros and cons to all of it. But the disease characteristics, that's one that regardless of performance, if we know the disease characteristics, we can help our customers place better varieties as well. So I know that is one that when I think about the incredibly valuable services our universities provide, without that, I know I can't do that. I can put high yielding varieties into the cropping systems that are important to my customers, but I don't have the bandwidth to say it's this for sea stripe, or it is or is not resistant to Hessian fly, or name your poison.
Right. So, Ken, I want to ask you a little bit different question, because the public programs are always ready to talk that, oh, well, public programs are completely unbiased because they're not trying to sell anything, okay? And yet I look at it the other way going, the companies have to get it right or your credibility goes all to hell.
100%.
You lose an awful lot of sales and opportunities that way. So how do you respond to your role as a researcher on the private side, the data you're generating, how that is presented to your growers, and how that compares with your responsibilities to what the public programs would do in response?
Yeah, so like you, I've heard that comment a lot, and the reason I was chuckling a little bit is, but my consequence is more severe, and you could argue that, and I think it's incredibly true. My consequence for being wrong is quite severe. We lose credibility, we lose customers. It's a financial hit to the company if we're not providing products that are of actual value. So unbiased is something, but I also have a vested, this is going to sound kind of weird, I have a vested interest in trying to increase productivity, increase profitability, and kind of make products work. But I guess roll with me a little bit on this, right? So I feel like a lot of what I see in the public sector is they try to disprove any product. Well, I can also make any variety in any product fail. Let me be clear, right? Like you can put it into a poor situation. I think it takes a bit more effort to figure out how it works and why it might. So biostimulants are an excellent example of that. I could put a biostimulant in a situation it will fail each and every time. I can also find biostimulants that are effective against the abiotic stresses that are important to my environment and will likely succeed in that situation. So, I mean, I kind of bring that up because if in a public or in a private setting, my customers vote with their dollars and they do it routinely. So if I'm providing information that doesn't bring value to them, or the fact that the recommendations that are my breeding or my testing program, research program often produce will go across 1,000,000 acres, it gets proved out really quickly. Really quickly. So that's the to me, the ultimate litmus test is it isn't just a theoretical, this might be okay. We will push that to the farm gate. It will go across many acres, and that acre is really good at proving out if that is a false assumption or not. So like even variety selections, it was terrifying to license a variety with McGregor's on it, because if that was going to fail, we were never going to be able to do that again. And it was going to go across a lot of acres really quickly. So you were going to find holes. So we had to be pretty darn confident in that recommendation.
Yeah, and I think that that's a great answer. And as one that's played both sides of that, I appreciate those sensitivities and concerns very much. And I think it's really important to have you there presenting that from the private side as I think, again, it's a different perspective and very much complementary to what the publics are doing.
Yeah.
They can't do everything, you can't do everything. And it's important to put it all back together to make sense for the growers. I think that's great.
Yep, absolutely. And we as in the McGregor company, I have Steve Van Vliet, who was an extension agent for WSU for years and years and years. And I mean, like that, he's on staff with the McGregor company. And to me, a lot of that goes hand in hand with I 100% value. There's not enough funding for wheat on the world for us to not be very conscious of the resources from that research perspective. So yeah, if there is basic, I'm going to call basic like discovery type research being done, and that could make a difference on a farm, we'll figure out how to take that basic information or that new discovery and make it farm data applicable.
No, that's great. I really do appreciate it. And I know I've kind of taken the liberty to do a lot of the quizzing and grilling here, and I really appreciate the chance to hear from you. Brittany, are there any other questions or comments on the chats that we want to get to before? I know we're about out of time already.
There are not other questions. You have done an excellent job, Jim, and I should have introduced you at the beginning and I didn't. This is Jim Peterson.
Sorry.
He's our Idaho Wheat Commission research consultant. So happy to have him asking all the right questions to Kat today. So thank you both so much for joining us. We are up against our 30-minute mark, so we don't want to take too much more of your time, but thank you again, Kat, for joining us. Thank you, Richard, also. The recording of this episode will be posted to our website, our YouTube channel, and our podcast platform. So if there's someone who, if you want to refer back to it at a future date, or if you want to share it with someone who wasn't able to listen in today, you are more than welcome to do that. It will stay up forever, and you can find it at idahowheat.org. So thank you again, and we will see you back here in a couple of weeks for our next From the Field.
Awesome. Thank you for having me.